I'm Bree Griffin. I work across community facilitation, design, and program creation at Rhizome, which is a nonprofit organization that has sought to preserve and support the creative use of technology since 1996. As a pathway towards broader celebrations of Rhizome's 30th anniversary this year, we're co-hosting the third season of Artwrld with Josh here. Thank you for the spa passes. And we have been highlighting various figures that shape Rhizome's community. So today we're excited to host Peter Burr. Peter has been practicing art for many years with an initial focus on expanding and supporting experimental animation and the multimedia scene via producing hundreds of touring programs. As an artist himself, Peter is a master of crafting technical systems that I would describe as retaining their humanity, finding a balance between incredible aesthetic sensibilities, complex simulations, and hard-coded play, humor, and light. When faced with massive LED walls and projections and digital installations, I think the public desire is to figure out the screen and move on. But we're challenged with a work that rewards the viewers with their attention. So the longer you sit with Peter's work, the more it kind of unfolds and reveals itself, becoming alive either in its entirety or possibly through the eyes of a tiny 8-bit character going about its life and doing its like tiny little task. Something I really have enjoyed seeing with Peter's work. Peter is currently in his second year as a PhD student at RPI in critical game design. So I've been feeling really curious about what he's been thinking about. And yeah, of course, he's prepared a special presentation for us today. So very excited to hand it off. And after the presentation, we'll end with some Q&A. So yeah, thank you for joining us.
Bree, thanks for the invitation. It's really an honor to be a part of this project, this space for folks like myself to talk about our work and to talk with you all. I'm going to try to keep this one tight. I'm going to dig as deep as I can into this idea of useful fantasy, which is the title of this talk. I'll come back to this idea a little bit more deeply at the end of it, but maybe where I'll kick things off is by acknowledging this kind of vague feeling that I've been having that's been growing for the past maybe 5 or 6 years, that everything I make these days feels like it gets claimed the moment it enters the world. Maybe I can blame the internet, maybe it's something else. But it's this feeling that I get when I put my work out into the world. It gets positioned inside a context I didn't choose, and I certainly wouldn't endorse it if you asked me. I make work, it goes out there, and then it comes back wearing some different face, right? Um, and it's still calling itself the same thing. It's still calling itself my work, this work that I'm putting out into the world. And I've been puzzling through this. As Bree mentioned, I'm pursuing a PhD right now. I'm actually writing a dissertation, so my brain is spinning. And I'm thinking a lot about fantasy, and I wonder if fantasy actually may offer an antidote to this feeling. This ability to picture different conditions, I think, is the first step towards refusing the current ones. And certainly you can't push back against something if you can't see past it. So just since this is an artist talk, I'm going to talk about my work. But I want folks to be thinking about fantasy, and I hope we'll have a lot of time to kind of dig into it and to talk about it. So as Bree mentioned, I've been making work for a long time. And I think for this whole time, past maybe 25 years or so, something that's really motivated me to make this work is the desire to make something that I haven't seen before. And oftentimes I find this happening by pushing at the edges of computer technologies that have come to take it for granted. So what we're seeing here is a Windows desktop intervention. It's a recording of it called Natural Contacts, collaboration with Mark Fingerhut, Matthew Gant, and Bridget DeFranco. Essentially, it's a piece of malware that's designed to take control of your computer for 24 hours and transforming it into this dynamic virtual garden that grows around a rotting corpse at the center, which you guys can see here in the rain. You can still use your machine to send emails or doom scroll or whatever it is that you normally do on a computer, but it puts it all in this different world. So seasons change over the course of this 24 hours, bugs gobble up plants, this corpse decays, and your computer is your computer. DM me if you want to experience it. I'll be happy to share the EXE with you. This is something that is meant to live with you for the day. So to rewind a little bit, and to kind of think through this trajectory of where this comes from and where fantasy enters the picture. I went to art school in the late 90s, and I got seduced by computers there as a tool to make art, which led me towards an animation practice, as Bree mentioned, which certainly anchors everything that I do today. But something that happened when I graduated from art school that I think was really formative is that I actually lost computer access when I graduated. At the time, I didn't own my own computer. I worked at the school's computer cluster, as they called it. So when I graduated, I didn't have money. I didn't have access to that cluster. So I moved towards using simpler materials to do this sort of animation work, thinking about making time-based media as an extension of my painting practice, which is what brought me to art school, but with simpler materials. So I was making zines, I was making comics, I was making screen printed and photocopied books and drawings. And I think this was really clarifying for me because it turned out the work that I wanted to make didn't need expensive infrastructure to produce. Things like a zine or a hand pressed DVD at the time, cheap handmade books, they're not a consolation prize. In a lot of ways, they're a more open-ended form than the work that I was making on a computer and that I still make today. Almost anyone can make them and share them. And the networks, importantly, the networks that they travel through are social in a way that's more self-sustained than anything that requires a plug and a wall socket, certainly. So for me, trafficking in these networks right after art school in my young 20s, it dawned on me that how you make a thing and how you distribute it are both really important moves towards building the world that you're trying to live in. So aesthetic forms and social formations are, in a way, inseparable. So like the materials that you choose, the venues that you seek out, the price of admission, who you're making it for, how it reaches them. These are not secondary questions after you make the work. They are the work. Every choice about form is a choice about what kind of a world you're proposing, which in my opinion is the most important thing that an artist can do. So where this thinking got mobilized, I want to take us to this project that ran between 2001 and 2005 called the Bookmobile Project, Projet Mobilive. I discovered these guys because their Airstream trailer parked on the lawn in front of my art school when I was a nearly graduated student. This project was a touring exhibition of artist books and zines and independent publications inside this Airstream trailer that was transformed into a gallery run by a group of artists, community activists, community organizers. And I was inspired to join this project. So for the last couple of years of it, we took yearly curated collections of artist books across the US and Canada, often visiting venues in remote, hard to reach places. And the idea here was really to challenge the way that most zines and artist books don't leave their respective communities. So for me, someone making this kind of work, maybe you go to the comic shop, maybe you go to the music store, maybe they have some zines, you know the people. But outside of that, where does that work go? And so this project offered access to a rotating collection of work, as well as leading these workshops and giving artist talks as we traveled. So working with these guys, my exposure with the Bookmobile Project really further reinforced my awareness around how the way that we present our work to an audience is something more fundamental than something that's been kind of creeping into my heart lately on the internet is a sense of brand affiliation. I think the way that we show our work is the thing that reinforces or breaks down the hierarchies around whose world we live in, right? Like what we make is important, but how we make it, I would argue, is really the thing. The Bookmobile, their idea, is a complicated project, but one of their ideas was explicitly trying to move against this institutional gravity and to insist that certain ideas deserve to travel and access to this work wasn't a privilege, right? So the question of who gets to participate in a freedom of mind project in this case is never separate from the project itself. And working with these guys inspired me to build something like it for experimental animation. So around this time, a couple of years of working with the Bookmobile project, I eventually got enough money to buy a laptop and start making animation again. But I had no idea where digital animation lived. So we're talking 2005, early 2005, before YouTube existed. I spent a lot of time kind of searching for this kind of work, and I really couldn't figure out a good way of finding access. So I made a space for it. I created this project called Cartoon Express. We see some images here of me and my friend Christopher and the performances that we did that kind of bookended these animation shows that we treated as this kind of living framework that was expanded through our performances, through installations. We went on tour mostly in our station wagon and put on these live shows with these experimental programs at their center. And I think at the heart of this, there is also this question here of how do you build and show digital worlds artwork that doesn't depend on expensive infrastructure to survive? This is something that I still struggle with. And with Cartoon Express, we kind of answered that by traveling light, traveling cheap. We could just show up places and scale to any venue as needed. So our first tour that we did, you can see some images of these inflatables in the lower right-hand corner. We had a bunch of inflatables that could scale. We had our keyboard, our bass, our guitar, a box of DVDs that we sold for 10 bucks a piece in an effort to fund the whole thing. And of course, at its core was this curated program, which if we needed, we had a bed sheet in our car so we could throw that up as a projection screen. Just as a quick plug, this summer, I'll be throwing a 20-year anniversary to mark the publication of our first DVD at Roulette in Brooklyn. And I'll be presenting a screening of short films called Useful Fantasy. Apropos of this presentation, Mesher will be performing, Matt Romine will be performing, and it's all going to be housed inside this slot machine installation that I'm making. So if anyone's interested, let's talk about it afterwards. So thinking about the early life of Cartoon Express, as platforms like YouTube, later Netflix, came to dominate the moving image industry, really shifted what it meant to be making experimental digital work. And so I shifted Cartoon Express into a commissioning project around longer form storytelling. What we're seeing here is a project called Special Effect. It was kind of our first large kind of cohesive project, which was a side make of the 1979 Tarkovsky film Stalker that I recast in the ruins of America's Borscht Belt, replete with about 20 commercial interruptions by this international cast of experimental animators who were beaming in from outside the zone. For folks who haven't seen Stalker or haven't read the source book Roadside Picnic, the central premise is that somewhere out there is a zone, and it's the site of this unnamed cataclysm. It's cordoned off, it's officially forbidden, but there's a rumor that deep inside the zone, there's a place where your wishes may be granted. And the titular stalker makes a living guiding clients through the zone's impossible logic towards that room. So the kind of pulpy sci-fi genre elements of it, I certainly thought were cool, but I think really what drew me to this premise was the idea of the zone itself. It's a place that doesn't follow the rules of the world outside it. You can't navigate it by logic or by reason alone. It demands a different kind of attention. It's slower, it's more open. You have to be willing to fail and be wrong. There's this high status. It's a fantasy space, and it intensifies the rawness of reality through that fantasy rather than simplifying it. It intensifies that mystery. And spoilers, the room at the center, nobody ever gets there. It's not really an escape from the world. It's the world that's made unbearably legible, and no one ever has the heart to actually make it there. So Special Effect is a project toured through 30 venues for a couple of years. We made a 12-inch vinyl of its soundtrack. While I was making this work, I was really thinking about how to approach software as an emotional medium, in part because I was binge watching at the time a lot of these 70s avant-garde films, directors like Tarkovsky, Ingmar Bergman, John Cassavetes. And I wanted to take this approach that I saw certainly proven through these filmmakers' work, this kind of sensitivity, this emotional quality translated into something inert. I wanted to try taking this approach with newer tools like motion capture, photogrammetry, face tracking, which is 2011, so you can just open up an app and Snapchat's doing it for you. There was a jankiness to it, and I actually like seeing what happened when I either purposefully or accidentally misused these technologies. I think that the ruptures that happen from that jankiness can be really informative and really expressive in a way that invites a kind of thinking that I like when it's done right. I think this kind of jankiness can also turn into an art world cliche, which I'm happy to talk about. But when it's done right, I think it creates these ruptures where something really important sneaks through. So when I finished touring this work, I had a problem, which is how do I archive a performance that takes place inside a dark cinema? It was a cinema performance, and it was really hard to document. beyond simply being an aesthetic or a technical question of like, how do I document this? There's also a practical concern here. And for other artists in the audience, certainly we know there's this practical component around institutional support, grants, residencies, the whole apparatus that I as an artist was increasingly relying on to make work of this kind of growing scale needs documentation. It's a strange form of capital for independent artists. And a video doesn't really capture what a live performance is like, especially when it's this kind of dark, boring video in a cinema. And so I wanted to think through how could I capture the logic of this piece, the liveness, the contingencies, the way it behaved differently every time. So I started looking at game engines, which again, spoiler number 2 for this talk, it turned out that working in game engines is really time consuming. It's really expensive to make the sort of game that would properly translate the stalker side make that I wanted to create to a screen. So despite this friction, this kind of archiving question, this archiving problem that I had, I found something that I liked here that was worth holding on to, being kind of emotionally exhausted from touring special effects as a performance. I still didn't really want to let the world go, but I didn't really want to live in Tarkovsky's world anymore. So I decided, let's use this interest in game engines and try to build something new, which became this project called Cave Exits, which was a 4-channel video cube that came out around the time that VR was really popular that year. Palmer Luckey was on the cover of Time magazine. And as an artist who's interested in exploring new media, I was finding companies on the kind of cutting edge of this burgeoning new media were very happy to kind of fund people who would try to figure out how to make interesting work in this space. But I was interested in not just sort of sheltering off an individual from the world, but creating what VR promised, but for a group of people. So I created this social space. After Cave Exits, I made this highly modular artwork called Pattern Language that rearranged itself many times in many different formats. It still does. I still show it in different ways to this day. Here's what it looked like in Times Square in 2018. And then I made a project called Dirt Scraper, another kind of fragment as I was developing this world slowly in the Unity game engine. So it's another highly modular, adaptable slice of this game world. And with all of this kind of iterative development, the idea was to one day bring it all together into a game I could put out for $10 to anyone who wanted to dwell in the zone too. And because I didn't have a ton of resources to make this kind of work, instead of throwing a lot of money on it, I threw a lot of time at it. So I've been developing this project piece by piece, each project carrying forward new motifs, kind of riffing on what was happening to me and in the world at that time, and bringing it into this kind of fantasy space. And here I am still, 10 years later, still making this game, which brings us to this present. Here I am in Montana, coming out here for the winter with the goal of focusing for a few months to try to consolidate the sprawling imaginary world into a project called Aria Engine, which I'll try to describe here. So it's a room-sized video game. It plays itself. It doesn't actually give a shit about you. It goes on without you controlling it. There's no PS1 controller. But there is a way to interact with it. There's a couple ways. You create an avatar when you enter the room using a slot machine that captures your likeness, and it spits your avatar out into this underground dungeon with the goal of remediating this AI-driven mess that's happening down there. At the center of this room, we get to watch the computer simulation as an endless feature film, so still thinking very much about cinema with your protagonist at the center. And at the back of the room is a 2-player arcade cabinet. For those of us that are paying close attention to this image I'm showing, if you look through the slot on the left side, you can see someone staring at us through this word communion. It's a place where you take turns with a friend or a stranger controlling the cyborg guts of your protagonist, choosing to digest or excrete memories of the things that they're discovering in this dungeon. And our choices influence the avatar's mood, and by proxy, the mood of this never-ending film at the room center. And so here's a quick video prototype of what this world looked like this past spring at FI in Montreal when I first built prototyping. And so while I've been consolidating this project over the past year that I've been building Aria Engine, I've been thinking a lot about fantasy and about imagination, in part because I'm employing, I think, what we call AI, these technologies. Perhaps we can talk about in the conversation after this. Um, and so I titled this talk Useful Fantasy. And now that we're at the end, I want to explain what I mean by that. So fantasy, just quickly define how I'm thinking about it. I think about fantasy as the capacity to imagine conditions that don't exist yet. It's not prediction. It's not planning. It's this ability to hold a different world in your mind long enough to start to want it, maybe. And something that I find really interesting about fantasy is that it often gets dismissed as escapism. Fantasy is escapist, and I think for good reason we critique it that way, because in that there's this question, what are we escaping towards when we manufacture a fantasy? And certainly right now, every major technology company that I'm kind of engaging with certainly is selling me a fantasy. There's this sense of frictionless productivity that I'm fantasizing about. There's this fantasy of machines that understand us, which I certainly got into at 2 a.m. a couple of nights ago when I was trying to kind of work through some ideas here that were haunting me and nobody to talk to. There's this fantasy of my problems dissolving on contact with the right algorithm. And there's this fantasy of these open generative worlds, generativity, this idea that we can build these systems that never run out, they never repeat, they never close. They're these open systems. But actually what these systems do is recombine what already exists into this kind of smooth, this series of smooth outputs that maybe feel new. They're a closed system performing openness. The door, when I'm kind of using these, the door looks like maybe it's swinging wide open to this open world, but actually I have the sense that I'm walking in a circle. And that's certainly not the kind of escape that I want. It's an escape into something that's smaller, that's more controlled. Maybe it's cozy, but in that kind of fantasy, in that kind of escape, you just close the doors and you call it creativity, right? And so the sort of fantasy that I'm interested in goes the other direction, towards a sort of a complexity, genuine surprises that I certainly can't predict, that you can't predict, that the folks that are building these technologies, these systems, when I plug my thing into the wall that makes that run, that they can't predict or control. And this is the kind of fantasy that actually intensifies the mystery of being alive, rather than smoothing it over into some sort of abstract general entity. So this is where I'm at. Thank you, everybody, for kind of tuning into this while I'm taking a break from making this world with you today. This thing where hopefully one day we'll all get to walk into this room. The slot machine will scan your face. It'll drop you into this underground world that's falling apart. There'll be a film at the center of it starring your avatar. And there's an arcade cabinet in the back where you make choices about your character and what they keep and what they throw away. It's something that I find really interesting about building this work is I still don't really understand what it's doing. Sometimes it's really genuinely beautiful, and sometimes it just breaks. Sometimes it just totally fucks up and it's janky. And that is actually the sort of fantasy that I'm interested in. It's not this escape from the world into this kind of cozy, closed-off space, but it's an escape towards something stranger and something more often than the sort of world that I'm often handed. Thank you, everybody.
All right, Peter, that was really fantastic. If you guys have questions, put it in the chat. Let me know if you would like to ask, which is, I think, like the preferred thing, or if you'd want me to ask for you. So, Bree, you
Oh
actually
yeah,
have
I
a question to start
immediately
off.
had a question.
Jump in.
I was really curious about like the non-playable game or game that plays itself, versus like the ability to provide interaction and control for people. And how do you approach like making the choice? Like when do you want to let people in versus let the system be the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of ways to talk about that. One of those is really practical, and one of those is conceptual. And maybe just to talk about it practical, because I feel that that's a bit more grounded. As someone who has been traveling, showing work in these social environments for a long time, I have to say that I can't, right now, I can't think of an interactive artwork that I think is a great artwork. It's something that I've struggled with as an artist who makes expanded cinema, these immersive interactive installations. There's something strange that happens when you have to share your work on something with a PlayStation logo or a Samsung logo that kind of breaks the barrier. That can be interesting, but oftentimes isn't. And I think there's also something tricky that happens when there's a social space and there's only one person kind of doing anything, right? And so in thinking about that dynamic, I'm interested in creating systems that can be portraits of themselves that ask you to engage with them perhaps more passively, right? And interactive work is still interactive when you're having to just use your neck and turn your neck and move your eyes to see what's happening, right? Just making something that's too expansive, I think, is a really compelling form of interactivity. And so there's that. So in thinking about Aria Engine, where my imagination dwells right now, having the slot machine as a way of kind of connecting with what it maybe looks like inside of that maze is something that I'm interested in. Trying to make it fun feels really important, but to make those components peripheral so that the main core of the experience is something that we can all kind of share and not be tuned into the kind of dopamine machine too explicitly, so that we still remember to look around and see our neighbors.
Very cool. Jason, you had a question.
I do. Hi, Peter.
Hey,
Hi, everyone.
Jason.
Hey, so my question, I wanted to know if you might be interested in speaking about any of the aesthetic choices. And then as like sort of another part of this, like I remember some time ago, you talked about how you specifically work with pixels. And I thought like that idea was really interesting. I actually saw you do some really interesting things in front of me that were actually maybe I don't know, could have been extremely basic for you, but actually magic in front of me watching you do something specifically with pixels on the computer. And I just wanted to see how that like informed the work, like stylistically, or if you've worked like this as a form of constraints, or if you could just speak about any of that. Yeah.
Yeah, all of that. And Jason, thank you. I think if I'm remembering correctly, I was using Photoshop simply to try to prepare a UV print. And it was like, I was doing, right? Like, thinking about pixels. And I mean, I think I'll talk about it in kind of these kind of conceptual formal ways second, but maybe to start, like the first time I ever made computer graphics was in the early 90s. We had a Mac, early Mac with a black and white monitor, and we didn't have a Super Nintendo yet, and I was kind of bored of my Nintendo. So this would be a place where I go play video games, and we had Mac Paint in there alongside SimCity and The Surgeon, these different games that I played. And so Mac Paint was a game that I played. And what was interesting about that, because it was a black and white screen, and the pixels look so great on a cathode ray monitor for folks that remember, like they glow, there's something interesting about them, is that if you want to make kind of tonal gestures, or you want to evoke something that, I mean, as someone who sees full color, like what my eyeballs just give me naturally when I look out to the world, Mac Paint used these fill patterns, these infinite fill patterns, and you could mix and match them. And so that was something like thinking about the pixel in this really fundamental way. I think having done some screen printing, there's a similar way of thinking about like what is the core kind of translation component here for your imagination. That just got me thinking specifically about graphics. And there was a point when I first moved to New York 15 years ago, I was going through, this was around the time where I was getting into Tarkovsky and going through this decade-long depression. And I was like making this high energy animation party work using After Effects and stealing stuff on the internet. It was vibrant and it was maximal. And I had to take a break from that. My entry point back in was revisiting Mac Paint. So there's something here in a lot of the work that I'm showing that started there and expanded as I asked myself, okay, how do I bring Mac Paint into more contemporary ecosystems, animation, game engines, things like that. So that's like maybe a little historical underpinning, but the formal question, which I think is maybe more interesting, I find it so funny. This was what, 20 years ago when Mac, maybe 15 years ago when Apple first started talking about the Retina display. They're using these biological metaphors to kind of negate the fact that our screens are just these grids of pixels. Anyone who has set up a video projector and tries to tune it, like you can see those pixels, right? There's a matrix there inherently. And so something in between the sense of my own nostalgia and anchoring myself as a formal constraint to these technologies and tactics that I've been using for many decades, combined with the fact that I'll take this from the expanded cinema discourse from the 60s and 70s. Like when I'm watching a movie, I'll sometimes feel like I'm falling through the hole that's projected into the wall, into this kind of fiction, right? The fantasy that's taking place. But actually, there is something just projecting light on a wall. And I think something I certainly am interested in is finding a place where we can acknowledge the material, right? The medium specificity, if we're going to get abstract expressionist about it. But there is something there that I think allows us to be in reality while also being in this fantasy space at the same time.
All right. Fantastic.
Thanks for that answer.
Yeah, Jason, thanks for the question.
Okay, I'll jump in with another one. I'm actually really curious about, how you think about the distribution of your art, because I was looking at those sort of like the early references with the Airstream and the poetry, and it's, one, I think it's a really interesting distribution mechanism. And then, but it also is also like highly like curated and interpreted, like there's people there.
Yeah.
And then you look at things like, where these things are distributed to shared spaces, but then also like where like YouTube or games, and
Yeah.
where and like where those things are experienced, but they can't necessarily be interpreted.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a complicated question because like right now, here we are, 2026, February 27th. I'm in Montana. I'm in Missoula, Montana. And I'm out here in part to hide, but maybe also partially motivated out here because I don't really know where to look now to find work that excites me. And I think a part of that is because, gosh, I think about when we announced this lecture, it's like, okay, I have to get on Instagram. It's just this advertise. It's so crass. It feels so crass. And I think we could talk about NFTs if you want. But I think there's something similar there where you feel this instrumentalization of something that I have been really invested in for decades and is really special to me. And then it gets translated into an economic token, or I mean, I guess we can call advertisements economic tokens, which, I mean, hey, that world exists too, right? Got to make a buck. But I also think that there are other reasons to make cultural objects. And that I think is really, it's a question that plagues me. It's part of why I was inspired to do this in June at Roulette, to do this 20-year anniversary Cartoon Express show, because I'm still searching for it. And part of that is that I'm aging. When I was touring around the world with special effects and I was doing it by myself, I got burnt out. I did 30 shows in 8, 10 countries, and I was tired. I didn't want to perform anymore. And so there's this kind of confluence of things where I'm feeling my body differently. I'm feeling my kind of attention differently. Um, and I'm still craving the same thing that maybe feels at this point a little nostalgic because I don't know where to find it. It's a natural pattern, but I think the work for me is to make it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Can I ask a quick follow-up question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. There's some great questions coming in the chat, so I don't want to monopolize. But I'm curious, how that relates to the audience, because probably when you were first starting off, the audience were your friends, other artists, like at your community, and then you go on tour and they're strangers, and then if you put it out into Instagram, it's people, the avatars. Like, how do you think about that idea of community and connection and who you're distributing to?
Yeah, I mean, I think like so I'm out here in Missoula also teaching, and so I'm mostly hanging out with students, and that has been really great because they're actually like we're working together, we're building something together, and it feels really good to be thinking about my audience not in this I use this term abstract general entity during my talk, but this in this way that like, oh, a person is a data point, and we can kind of consolidate all the important information about them and get a representative picture. Certainly, COVID magnified that for me, which is really different than actually being in a space with your audience and kind of knowing it. And I think this is something that I struggled with when we were quote, quote, promoting this event on Instagram is, right, this sense of being forced into this abstraction of abstracting our audiences so that we can mobilize and instrumentalize them. With Cartoon Express, I mean, I guess, listen, I never really thought about it too seriously. I kind of hoped I was just like going out into the world. I was lucky enough to, if anybody played the video game Sims 2, when that game was coming out, an ad agency, Wieden and Kennedy, hired Christopher and I to do an ad campaign where we pretended to make we pretended to be players of this game, and we made this little commercial that funded us being able to put out a DVD, right? So there's always been this kind of improvisatory thing that allowed us to build from our network. So like, how do you book a tour, right? With Bookmobile, how do you book a tour? You start with the people that you know. And I mean, I think there's something old school about that certainly feels kind of broken now that I don't know how to use Instagram anymore. I don't want to use Instagram, right? I don't know what to use now to like have a space that feels like a commons.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Eddie, let me ask you a question, then Bria, we'll jump to you afterwards.
Oh, my question?
Yes.
Oh, sure. You mentioned MS Paint, and I have that kind of triggers all kinds of things because I remember all that stuff too. So it just makes me, and you started mentioning a lot of things about nostalgia. So like it just I realized like there's a specific angle of attack that you're kind of taking on this kind of nostalgia. It operates a certain way for you. So well, just in a completely practical, formal way, like, do you use older means to actually create those nostalgic effects? But you also mentioned Unity. So like, do you use like contemporary things and start simulating those things as you remember them? And as a result of that, like, how do you imagine like your audience is actually engaging with this kind of nostalgia?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eddie. So early on, when I was first doing that explicitly nostalgic work, I mean, I was doing Freudian psychotherapy, and so I was explicitly revisiting these moments of my life, which led me down this path that maybe lasted for a year or so, which was about, okay, can I translate the logic of what Mac Paint gave me towards other tools. And actually, the first time I worked with Mark Fingerhut, who made Natural Context with me, the kind of opener, he helped me create a shader so that we could do this Atkinson dithering algorithm, which Bill Atkinson was the inventor of Mac Paint, essentially. He worked with Susan Kerr on that. Nowadays, it's not explicitly about trying to translate anything. I suppose it's kind of boiled down into a set of constraints that I use so that I'm moving kind of slowly and methodically towards building out the logic of this world. And there's certain traps where I think when we're trying to move really quickly, and that we can talk about AI tools as part of this, you just get sort of shepherded into an aesthetic, regardless of whether or not you like it. There are other artists in this room that do this kind of technology and use the Unreal game engine. I think anybody that's played a AAA game, there's just this look that it has. And I think that can be really difficult as someone who's making work when it just looks like everything else that's happening. Or let's say in 30 years, you look back at that work and it's like, oh, this work looks so blah, 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 name your date. So, I mean, I think another way of thinking about fantasy is like, how can we employ these tactics so that we're creating an alternative vector, like an alternative path for ourselves? And so for me, this reverse engineering of Mac Paint, for you, Eddie, it was MS Paint, right? Same era, similar kind of thing. It was just using more fundamental logics for how to do graphics computing that, so turn off anti-aliasing so everything doesn't look blurry. It makes things kind of crisp and sharp, and it makes it so that when I'm setting up an installation with a projector, I'm kind of fighting it. But at the same time, it forces me to move up to a certain standard of fidelity and quality. And as a kind of byproduct, it creates a specific aesthetic or a specific look, which we can again talk about branding. But as someone who every morning comes into my studio and I'm like, okay, I need to get motivated again, seeing work that I've never seen before, or like knowing what this is and that's something that I'm actually building and not just inheriting a technology that's freighted with all this shit that I don't want, it's really liberating.
Oh, great. Bree, you had a question.
Oh yeah. Let me see. I asked about, I guess, as an artist, how important scale is for you, because I think often digital artists are presented with the opportunity to just do the thing they're doing, but like on big screen. Um, I wonder
Yeah.
if you find this limiting, or do you love the challenge of taking over space? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's cool having the opportunity to show your work on hundreds of LED screens in Times Square, right? And having the fluency with mode of making work so that that's possible and that I feel like I have control over it looking the way that I want it to look. Like that's really cool. But I think on the other side of that, I talked about scalability. Maybe I didn't name it in such a way, but thinking about with Cartoon Express when we were going on tour, of like, how can you make sure that you're sustaining a digital practice, that you're sustaining a digital practice. And I think the scale problem is tricky because when we get accustomed to these high value, high cost kind of presentation formats that maybe require something to be really bright or really dark or really expensive, it starts to close down the way in which we can show work and who gets access to our work. Like even, I mean, I think there's a larger conversation there, but I'm always coming back to this question of like, how can I make the thing that's a room-sized video game with a slot machine? And I'm here in Montana because I have resources here. I'm working with 5 amazing students. We have a little workshop. We're like really cranking. But then while we're also doing that, I'm thinking like, okay, what else is there? So it doesn't just get stuck. Because in addition to like access in the moment of having a broader audience and different kind of people seeing it, I find that when our work needs a really bespoke, massive kind of scale system, it's probably not going to get shown a lot because it's like too specific. So I'm always thinking about what's the core of the work. And this is what got me thinking about world building as a practice, like systems building, so that this work can be reorganized and reframed and rescaled, but it still resonates with the thing that is most essential to me when I made it.
Very cool. Veronica, you had a question.
Yeah, I wish I could remember what the piece was called. Also, hey PB.
Hi, Veronica.
During your presentation, there was a piece that had just this really, really awesome, almost like a video game sound. So I'm so curious where sound factors into your creative process.
Yeah, the one piece that I showed that actually had a soundtrack. I knew we only had, I was like limited to a half hour and I wanted to talk with you guys, so that was the only thing. So that soundtrack was composed by Chris Perello, is being composed by Chris. And that sound has always been really interesting because if we think back to like early Cartoon Express days, and I showed you those images of me and Christopher Dolgaris performing what ended up being kind of bookends to these animation programs. We lived together, we ran this project together, we owned a car together, we were in a band together, we made music together, we made animation together, and so it was all very fluid and it happened together. Christopher is an amazing musician, and so he was really spearheading that, and my trip was maybe a little admin. I was doing a lot of the tour booking, but also making the animations, and we both traded off, but it was always this thing. At the time we thought about it as like, if anyone has ever like grown a crystal, there's this way in which I find it so interesting. It's like, how is this crystal growing? And like, what's happening is it's growing very slowly, and the environment that it's in is kind of influencing it in this way for it to kind of grow upwards or outwards or however you're trying to grow that crystal. And I always thought about my animation work the same way, that we're like making the music, we're making the visuals, and then we're going back to them. So it's this really high composting kind of project. Ooh, sorry, a bee just flew into me. Montana bees, maybe it's good. We have like a honeybee sanctuary just outside the campus here. Anyway, so nowadays, what is interesting, working on this project, I'm working with Chris for the first time. And so I'm still trying to maintain this kind of really open, flowy mode with somebody new. And so what it means is that we spend a lot of time talking. Right? And so he's responding to me. And maybe I'll share this story if anyone here is also a fan of Koyaanisqatsi, the best music video ever made. There's a DVD extra where Godfrey Reggio talks about working with Philip Glass and how he would send Philip a cut of the film and he would make a score and then he would recut it, right? So there's this way to kind of like undermine what is like the logical intention at first to try to find something in the moment that can emerge that could maybe be better than the really sharp logical version of it. And so that's something that Chris and I are doing right now.
All right, fantastic. Matthew, you had a question?
Oh. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was just going to ask a question about how you approach new technologies in the pursuit of storytelling? How do you preserve the world building core or archetype or whatever you want to call it when you start to approach a new technology, say like digital signage or projection or projection mapping or whatever? Can you talk a little bit about that process of how you preserve the core of the idea?
Yeah, so Matthew, you mentioned storytelling, and I don't want to get distracted by that idea if you mean something different. Like, is it about telling stories, or is there something different about like allegory or essence?
No, more just about when you approach a project, you're coming at it from a particular, I guess, with a particular outcome in mind. And when you do so in the face of new technology, how do you preserve that core without being distracted by the shiny object of the new technology or that tool?
Yeah, well, I think um, I think when I'm cooking up a new idea, unless I have like a really short timeline, in which case all that's out the door and you're just trying to make it. Normally, I'm not approaching something with this idea of like what it is that I want to say. Normally, I'm approaching a new work with a question of like what is happening here. And sometimes that question is about the shiny new technology. And so I'm looking for something to kind of emerge from that. Or sometimes I'm using that technology to ask that question, in which case I'm involved in a process of attunement. So sometimes what that means is I don't end up using a technology because it's getting in the way. And I brought up Unreal Engine here. I've done a couple of
Sure.
projects in that. And that's
Yeah.
something that I keep coming to and I keep throwing away because I do find it to be um, listen, like I certainly could keep chipping away at it, but it's like there's this sense of friction, and it's like it
Yeah.
just isn't enjoyable, right? Like it's like
Right.
it's pushing me somewhere I don't want to go, and so that's certainly something that happens with new technology. I said it in the artist talk. It's being kind of open to failure, right? Like you're walking this path, and sometimes it may be failure, and I'm always trying to stay attuned to like, is that failure creating a kind of rupture or a jankiness that actually says something interesting, or is it actually just making your work worse? And so
Yeah.
it's a matter of questioning, I think.
Yeah, if I'm hearing you right, there's a certain tolerance to friction, and that friction may yield something interesting that you didn't intend. But in the case of Unity, which I know is a massive friction, huge friction point, I can see how that would get in the way. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
All right. I think we didn't like Unreal, but yeah.
Well, I mean, they're right. They both have their own frictions, like Unity and
I love
Unreal.
you. No, it's true
Yeah.
though. 100%. 100%. Dev, you had a question.
Yeah, just real quick, you talked about archiving and how difficult it is, especially to document performance work. But I mean, I think digital work, everybody has trouble figuring out how to document digital work or archive it, so when something's aging. Have you found new or better solutions for that, for video works that maybe you made 10 or 15 years ago?
Yeah, gosh, no. I mean, I brought up that story about wanting to archive special effect because where it led me was into a kind of systems mode of thinking as a way to preserve like emergence, or like this how fun performance is to not only do but to watch, right? To like it's what we're doing today. It's cool that I'm like, what's gonna happen next? Like that feeling is really great. And so in terms of actually like documenting this work, I really think that the for me nowadays the biggest challenge is actually like how to share it with the world in a way that preserves what I want to preserve in that. And I think there's a long legacy of like experimental artist films that distribution companies would maybe preserve that. You're not just going on Vimeo or YouTube to see that work. Sometimes I put my work out that way, but it's just like it feels so harsh to have a Doritos ad before uh, film that I made where I was really trying to work through certainly a non-Doritos question. Um, I think like having access to digital tools where you're making with this digital native, in a way, it feels like it's never been easier to try to archive something. But yeah, I guess that's where my imagination goes. It's like how to present it in a way where you're actually showing what it means or what you want it to be. And that's the thing that I'm puzzling over.
All right. Enrique, I think we have time for another question.
Hey everyone, hey Peter, thank you
Hey.
so much for your talk. So I work with interactive art as well, and I always wonder how much instructions is enough instruction for people experiencing your artwork. So I wonder how you deal with your practice, like how you instruct someone, like you have installation with a controller or a new technology, how you deal with that in your practice.
Yeah, Enrique, thanks for the question. I think for me, what that question cuts to is the heart of why I said earlier, like I can't think of an interactive artwork that I think is like an amazing artwork, because I think there is always this problem of, let's call it onboarding. To this day, on my computer, my desktop background is Peter Bruegel's The Triumph of Death. If you haven't seen it, look at it right now. It's like it's been on my desktop for like 10 years, and every time I look at it, it kind of gives me something new. There's this like kind of emergent quality, in part because I trust that Peter Bruegel hundreds of years ago was like doing something, and so I just let it kind of happen on me. And so that's one kind of work that I really like, and that's the sort of work when I think about when I go to the Whitney Museum or whatever, when I go to an art museum or an art gallery, like the experience that I want. And then there's like playing Elden Ring or Slay the Spire or whatever video game I have that I'm engaging with at the time, which is a really different sort of experience. And that's something I'm interested in making, but it's not something that I'm doing at the moment because I think for me, I relegate those design questions of like, how do you actually reduce your audience's friction to feel like they have agency in the world? And so for right now, because my practice with this project is about digging into the world and trying to make sense of it as a way of making sense of this world that we're sharing here in this Zoom window. It's like this kind of bridge that it comes second. So yeah, I'm sorry I'm not answering your question with any kind of like axioms or
No,
like,
no.
yeah.
Just wanted to hear you. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it feels like a design practice, which is a little bit different than an art practice.
Yes.
Okay. All right, we're almost at time, but I think we could squeeze one more in. Sound, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for fitting me in. Hi,
Hey.
I think my question is, in what way, if any, are you thinking about how fantasy is a way to imagine better worlds? And are there any philosophies, systems, concepts that you are addressing or challenging in your projects? Because right now, a lot of community organizers and activists have been really honing in on this message that right now it's a really important time to think beyond the current political climate that we're in. It's not enough to think about changing the administration. It's important to think beyond what happens um, for change to actually happen. So I was wondering if there are any, if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, it sounds.
Sorry, it's a big question.
No, it's a great question, and I'm Josh. Thanks for giving Sound the soapbox, because I think this is the heart of what it is I'm trying to work through. And again, I mean, similar to my apologies to Enrique, I don't have an axiom or a prescription here, but I certainly can say that I think, there's a difference, like thinking about fantasy being escapist. I didn't want this talk to be about Ursula Le Guin, but if anyone's interested, look up Ursula Le Guin, Fantasy is Escapist. You'll find this great essay where she kind of talks about how it's a prisoner's duty to escape a prison that they're not meant to be in, right? It's like very different than this idea of escaping into something kind of cozy where you're enjoying the barbarian story or what have you, right? You're making fan fiction. And so in thinking about like political imagination, I think dreams, fantasy, allowing ourselves to sharpen our ability to fantasize is a way of allowing our imaginations to sharpen so that we're thinking in a world that's broader than the one that we're being handed. And I think what has been so devastating politically, being in the United States for the past 10 plus years, is the way in which seeing like well-intentioned liberalism, let's call it, like well-intentioned community organizing and systems of care somehow have been undermined, right? I mean, look around us. There's a lot of success, but there's a lot that has been undermined. And so my sense of being in the world, I mean, maybe I'll get a little woo-woo for a second, is recognizing that when I'm panicking, which I unfortunately I deal with anxiety, I'll find myself panicking. Like my ability to be in the world outside of the idea or the thought that is yoked on the thing that I just saw on Instagram, whatever my attention has been captured by, my ability to move beyond that really shrinks when I'm panicking. And so I kind of think about imagination in this way of like, can we come back to a practice as artists where we're really sharpening our ability to look beyond a sort of limp-wristed identity politic gesture or a instrumentalized political gesture that is responding to that thing we saw on Twitter or whatever, somebody else's dream, somebody else's prescription. Because often my sense is that when we sense that something is happening, that the real power is actually lurking elsewhere behind it. And in my experience, I've actually found the greatest success when my imagination is mobilized with the people that are actually around me, and we're co-creating something and we're letting that spread. And I think for that, imagination and fantasy needs to play a huge part because we need to envision something that's different than what is most obviously being handed to us on our phone.
Amazing. All right,
Thank
great.
you.
We're at time. This is great. This is such a fantastic presentation and conversation. Bree, do you want to tell us what's happening next week, and then we'll hand it over to Peter for kind of last thoughts, parting words. How can we kind of support you and help and engage with your work? Bree, though, back to you.
Oh yeah. Next week we'll be having a talk with Agnieszka Karant. Super excited about that. Please tune in. We'll be sharing the link as soon as we can to RSVP. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
All right, and Peter, parting words.
Hey, if you're in Montana, hit me up, DM me. If you want a computer virus, same thing. I'm hiding out here for a little while, but in the summer, June 11th at Roulette, Cartoon Express, useful fantasy. Come check it out. It's going to be awesome. And we do have discount codes because they have this mandatory $25 admission fee, which I'm not excited about. So we have cheaper tickets for those that want them.
All right, amazing. We will spread the word close to the date. Peter, thank you so much again for being here. This was really fantastic. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for the great questions. Hope to see you next week. Have a wonderful weekend. All right, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks for